Right now, there is a major shift happening behind the scenes that could completely change how Americans receive financial relief in the coming months. And if you've been hearing about that widely discussed $2,000 stimulus or dividend payment, then what I'm about to explain may completely reshape your expectations because the conversation is no longer as simple as, are we getting $2,000 or not? Instead, it has evolved into something much more complex, much more uncertain, and in some ways, potentially even more realistic. And that is the idea of a $1,145 refund payment that is now being talked about as a possible replacement. And the reason this shift is happening comes down to a combination of legal decisions, economic realities, and political strategy all colliding at once. Over the past several months, there has been a steady drumbeat of discussion around the idea of distributing money directly to the public, something that initially gained traction when the president floated the concept of a dividend-style payment, essentially taking a portion of government revenue and redistributing it back to the people, and, at the time, that idea seemed straightforward enough because the funding source was clearly defined. It was supposed to come from tariff revenue, which had been generating hundreds of billions of dollars, and the proposal was simple in theory. Collect the money through tariffs and then return a portion of it to the public in the form of a $2,000 payment, excluding higher-income individuals, which added a layer of targeted relief to the plan. As time went on, this idea didn't just fade away, it actually gained momentum, being mentioned repeatedly in speeches, interviews, and social media posts. And that repetition led many people to start believing that this payment was not just a possibility, but something that was increasingly likely. And when you hear something enough times, it starts to feel real. It starts to feel like it's already on the way. And that's where expectations began to build. But at the same time, there were always underlying questions about whether the numbers would actually work and whether the legal framework supporting those tariffs would hold up under scrutiny. Then came the turning point, a decision that changed everything almost overnight, when the Supreme Court stepped in and ruled against the legality of certain tariffs, effectively declaring that they could not continue in their current form. And this wasn't just a minor adjustment or a technical correction. This was a major disruption because it directly impacted the very revenue stream that was supposed to fund the $2,000 payments. And when that revenue stream is suddenly called into question, the entire foundation of the proposal starts to crack. The ruling didn't just stop future collections, it also raised the issue of what should happen to the money that had already been collected, which was estimated to be around $300 billion over the course of roughly a year. And that's where things started to get even more interesting, because now the conversation shifted from, how do we share this revenue, to, should this money actually be returned? And that distinction is incredibly important because it changes the entire framing of the situation, turning it from a discretionary payment into something that could be seen as a form of reimbursement. Almost immediately after the ruling, there was a response from the administration. New tariffs were introduced at a lower rate, starting at 10% and then quickly adjusted to 15%. But even with those changes, the reality is that the new tariffs are not expected to generate the same level of revenue as the previous ones. And that creates a gap, a significant gap between what was originally expected and what is now realistically available. And when you're talking about funding large-scale payments to millions of people, that gap becomes a critical issue. At the same time, lawmakers, economists, and officials across various states began to analyze the impact that these tariffs had on everyday households. And what they found was quite striking because the data suggested that the average household had effectively paid an additional $1,845 over the past year due to increased costs linked to tariffs. And this figure wasn't just pulled out of thin air. It was based on detailed studies looking at price increases, supply chain effects, and consumer spending patterns, all of which pointed to the same conclusion, that the burden of tariffs ultimately falls on consumers. And this is where the idea of a refund payment started to gain traction, because if households have effectively paid an extra $1,945 due to these policies, then returning that exact amount starts to make a lot of sense, not as a bonus, not as a profit-sharing mechanism, but as a direct reimbursement, And that shift in narrative is powerful because it reframes the payment as something that people are owed rather than something they are being given. Now, on the surface, the difference between a $2,000 dividend and a $1,245 refund might not seem that significant. It's only a few $100s, and both involve money going back to the public. But when you look deeper, the implications are quite different, because a dividend implies that the government is sharing surplus revenue, while a refund implies that the government is returning money that should not have been collected in the first place. And those are two very different justifications, both politically and economically. What makes this situation even more complicated is the timing, because when these ideas were first introduced, there was a sense that any potential payment would need to be carefully timed, possibly aligned with key political moments. But now, with the refund concept gaining ground, the urgency shifts because refunds are typically expected to be issued more promptly without the same level of strategic timing, and that could influence how quickly any decision is made. Despite all of this discussion, all of these numbers, and all of these proposals, it's important to understand that nothing has been finalized, nothing has been approved, and nothing has been scheduled for distribution, and that uncertainty is something that cannot be overstated because while it's easy to get caught up in the excitement of potential payments, the reality is that there are still many moving parts, legal considerations, budget constraints, and political negotiations that all need to align before anything actually happens. And this is where a more cautious mindset becomes essential, because if you start planning around money that hasn't been confirmed, you're putting yourself in a position where disappointment becomes very likely, and we've seen this before, where expectations build up based on discussions and headlines, only for the final outcome to fall short or take much longer than anticipated. And that's why it's always better to treat these developments as possibilities rather than guarantees. At the same time, it's also worth acknowledging that the continued discussion around these payments is not happening in a vacuum. The fact that officials keep bringing it up, analyzing it, and debating it suggests that there is at least some level of seriousness behind it, because ideas that have no chance of moving forward typically don't get this much attention over such an extended period of time, and that ongoing conversation keeps the possibility alive, even if the details remain uncertain. As we look ahead, the next several months will likely be critical in determining the direction this takes because there are still questions that need to be answered, such as how the remaining tariff policies will be structured, how much revenue will actually be available, and whether there will be enough political support to move forward with any kind of payment, whether it's a dividend, a refund, or something else entirely. There is also the broader economic context to consider, because decisions like these don't happen in isolation. They are influenced by factors such as inflation, government spending, and overall economic stability, and any large-scale distribution of money needs to be evaluated within that bigger picture, which adds another layer of complexity to the decision-making process. In the end, what we're seeing right now is a transition, a shift from one idea to another, driven by new information and changing circumstances, and while the $2,000 payment may have been the headline that captured everyone's attention initially, the $1,745 refund is emerging as a more grounded, data-driven alternative that reflects the actual impact of recent policies on households. But until there is a clear announcement, a signed piece of legislation, or an official distribution plan, everything remains in the realm of possibility rather than certainty. And that's the key takeaway here: to stay informed, to understand the reasoning behind these proposals, but also to remain realistic about what has and hasn't been confirmed. Because at the end of the day, whether it's called a dividend, a stimulus, or a refund, the name doesn't really matter. What matters is whether the money actually reaches people's pockets, and if it does, then it becomes a meaningful moment. But until then, it's a story that is still unfolding, still evolving, and still very much uncertain, and that's exactly why it's so important to keep watching closely as new developments continue to emerge.